Armor is everything to Russia. When Vladimir Putin first invaded Ukraine, he did so with massive quantities of tanks and armored vehicles, setting the stage for a series of mechanized assaults that almost worked. When Ukraine pushed Russia back, the armor ramped up. The more, the better was Putin's approach, as he thought that a war of attrition would wear out Ukraine's defenses. Putin was wrong. Russia has become the victim of its own attritional tactics. Now Russia is so desperate that it's fielding any armor that it can get its hands on. Putin is deploying rotting Soviet armor because Ukraine obliterated everything else. On October 7th, United 24 media reported that Russia had stepped up its efforts to pull up and restore as many of its aging infantry fighting vehicles, or IFVs, as it can from long-term storage. Right now, the country's focus seems to lie on the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base, which is located in the Kostroma region. That base is being emptied of the last surviving IFVs that it has, and the endeavor isn't going well for Russia. Those IFVs aren't just old. Many of them are rotting shells of the vehicles they used to be. We know that the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base has been reactivated due to satellite images showing that there is heavy activity at the site. Shared by the Jompy X account, those images offer a before and after view of the base that shows how old IFVs are being removed, likely due to Russia planning to repair as many of them as possible. Jompy highlights some of the key takeaways from these initial images in follow-up posts, including several zoomed-in images that show how Russia has cannibalized the hulls of several dozen of the old IFVs at this base to repair the few that seem to be operational and awaiting deployment. It's obvious why this is a problem for Russia. When several IFVs have to be dismantled due to their terrible condition just to get one IFV up and running, equipment stockpiles deplete faster. For every single vehicle that Russia is able to send to Ukraine, it's losing 2 or 3 more that have to shed whatever working parts they have to get that single vehicle working in the first place. Further examination of the satellite images showcases just how bad things have gotten at the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base. Bare T-80 hulls litter the base, most without turrets, and clearly utterly useless beyond perhaps providing a spare part or two when it comes to the war. The base is also home to a wrecked BTR-50. Jompy says that what we see in these images is a sign of Russia's growing desperation. It can't deploy specific pieces of armor anymore. It has to scour its bases for whatever it can get its hands on, no matter how old or rotten that armor might be. United 24 adds that analysts believe that the vehicles in the images are either being restored to send to Ukraine, or in more cases than not, stripped down for spare parts that might be able to keep Russia's depleting stockpiles running. This process of cannibalizing old vehicles to keep others running is far from a new one for Russia. In a February article, The Insider noted that Russia's primary source for heavy equipment and armor remains its Soviet-era stockpiles. New production is nowhere near sufficient to compensate for battlefield losses. T-90M tanks are the only model still produced from scratch, with an estimated 250 units built per year, the outlet says. When it comes to IFVs, the outlet adds, only the BMP-3 is still in mass production. Russia managed to build 463 of these vehicles back in 2023, far fewer than the loss rate of its IFVs in Ukraine. Back in February, Russia was already down to between 41 and 52% of its pre-war reserves at many of its storage sites, the Insider says. We're now approaching the end of 2025, and it seems likely that this figure has fallen so dramatically that Russia is being forced to restore IFVs that it would never have considered using just a year or two ago. We touched on rotting shells a moment ago. This is a problem of Russia's own making. One of the reasons why the IFVs and tanks seen at the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base are in such terrible condition is that Russia has a strange habit of storing most of its stockpiled vehicles outdoors. The IFVs at the base have been left in these conditions for years, perhaps even decades, meaning constant exposure to the elements and Russia's harsh winters have caused major issues. Severe metal corrosion leaves many of Russia's Soviet-era IFVs unusable right from the start. The few frames that somehow managed to avoid this problem may still have to deal with rusted hulls, broken engines, and degraded electronics that make them practically useless without expensive and time-consuming restoration. And even when Russia has gone through all of the restoration work, what is it left with? A Soviet-era IFV that a Ukrainian drone could take out of the equation in seconds. Putin must be kicking himself. A policy of outdoor storage that was likely meant to save Russia some money during peacetime has come back to bite Putin hard. Frankly, the way that Russia stores what could have been useful equipment is shocking. Dargins said as much in a November 2024 article where it shared insight from a Russian military blogger who analyzed many of the issues with Russia's military hardware storage sites. Dargins says that the blogger points out how storing equipment outside is a practice that dates back to the Soviet era, when resources for building even the simplest of shelters were stretched thin. The blogger estimates that an average of 3 dilapidated BMP-1 or BMP-2 vehicles must be combined to produce one functional vehicle after major refurbishments, the outlet reports, confirming a point that we made earlier. A storage facility holding 5,000 IFVs would only end up producing around 1,600 that are actually usable in this scenario. The rest would be torn to pieces in a desperate hunt for any components or parts that could be used on the vehicles that aren't quite as rotted as the rest of them. To compound Russia's equipment woes, it spent years selling off the Soviet-era equipment that was in the best condition to other countries before Putin invaded Ukraine. The lack of foresight is astonishing. Presumably, Putin has known that he wanted to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine ever since he began his initial campaign of aggression in 2014. Still, Russia sold, leaving itself with the oldest and lowest quality Soviet stock it had because it was chasing what little profit there was to be made. Perhaps it wasn't a lack of foresight, it was more likely arrogance. Putin thought the IFVs he's now desperately restoring at the 111th Tank Reserve Base would never have to see the light of day because Ukraine would roll over as soon as Russia invaded. When that didn't happen, it quickly became apparent that Russia's massive armor stockpiles were an illusion. Based on what Dargins reports from the military blogger, the amount of usable armor Russia has is about a third of what it was believed to have before the war started. Don't for a second believe that these rotting and cannibalization problems are restricted to the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base either. Other Russian facilities have the same problems. In July, a group of Ukrainian partisans named Artesh, operating in Crimea, scouted the territory of a military medical unit based in Sevastopol. It seems that it's not just tanks and IFVs that Russia is happy to allow to rot away due to exposure to the elements. As of now, the unit is in decline, the territory is neglected, and the equipment is rotting under the sun. Security measures have completely failed. A daily guard unit is present on site, but they mostly sleep or start drinking closer to the evening, Artesh reported after its scouts returned from the site. Almost a year earlier, in September 2024, Defense Express published an interesting article in which it reported on the results of a small examination of 61 of Russia's T-80 main battle tanks. Like the tanks and IFVs at the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base, these tanks have been left in long-term storage. To Russia, that means dumped outside with not even the most basic of coverings to protect them. Of the 61 tanks examined, 44 had technical failures that likely made them unusable in Ukraine. 21 of these failures were related to the tank's armaments, with the rest being issues related to electrical, radio, transmissions, or engine equipment. Again, we're seeing that 1 in 3 number coming up. Of the 61 tanks, about 2/3 weren't usable, and the other third likely required maintenance via the cannibalization of the tanks that weren't working. Time and again, we see the same issue. Russia burns through what it sends to Ukraine. In desperation, it then pulls from stockpiles that are already rotting or, at the very best, in states of disrepair. And if the Crimea situation is anything to go by, Russia's troops don't even maintain the equipment they receive once it's sent to them. It's no wonder that Putin is so desperate. The rot runs deeper than he could ever have imagined. Let's hone back in on the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base for a moment. United 24 media says that this base is one of the key Russian storage facilities in the country's central military district. In other words, it's not some long-neglected base that Russia has just remembered that it has. That would at least offer a reason for the poor condition of its tanks and IFVs, if not an excuse. This is a base that holds a massive share of Russia's reserve armor. Logically, you'd think that would also mean that it's a base where Russia invests heavily into maintenance and proper storage. Apparently not. Back in 2022, United 24 says the 111th Central Tank Reserve was home to 307 serviceable tanks, with 61 of those tanks being kept under dry air storage conditions. So at least Russia was taking care of some of its tanks in the same year that it invaded Ukraine. Granted, it was only taking care of about 1/5 of them, but that's better than nothing. The facility was also used to store 561 units of armor in reserve, while another 207 units had been marked for disposal. In total, the base had 1,075 tanks and 360 covered parking spaces. That would have been fine if Russia had only had to use the serviceable tanks at the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base. There were at least enough covered parking spaces, albeit nowhere near enough that also offered hangar-based dry air storage conditions to guard the base's operational tanks from the elements. The problem is that Russia burned through the operational armor quickly. That left it with the reserve, and over 3.5 years of pulling from this increasingly decrepit stockpile, has led to the situation that we see at the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base today. The dregs are all that Russia has left as Putin continues his desperate search for the armor that he needs to launch the same kinds of mechanized assaults Russia used to grind down Ukraine in the early months of the invasion. How did Russia end up being so desperate? Ukraine is the answer. Russia is pulling the last few ancient IFVs and tanks it has in the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base because Ukraine has absolutely obliterated everything else that Russia has sent. We only need to look at the raw numbers to see that. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, Russia has lost a staggering 11,240 tanks in Ukraine between the first day of Putin's invasion and October 8, 2025. Armored fighting vehicles, which include IFVs, have fared even worse. Russia has lost 23,324 of them as of October 8th, with 5 of those vehicles having been destroyed on October 7th alone. Think back to Russia's manufacturing figures that we shared earlier in the video. We told you that Russia is only building around 250 new T-90 tanks annually, along with 463 modern IFVs. That's nowhere near enough to cover Russia's vast losses in Ukraine. 250 new T-90s aren't going to cover a churn rate that amounts to about 3,000 tanks annually. The same goes for the IFVs. Russia loses about 6,500 armored vehicles per year. What Russia is building doesn't account for a tenth of what it's losing in Ukraine. Hence the stockpile scavenging. Russia has to rely on its ancient and rotting armor because it has nothing else left. There are questions about how long Russia can keep relying on this strategy before it finds itself going back to places like the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base, only to find that there's nothing left there to revive. It seems that Russia is already starting to run low, as revealed by an unexpected set of statistics. On September 9th, Important Stories reported that data from the open-source intelligence project Oryx suggests that Russia's equipment losses during the summer of 2025 dropped significantly compared to previous months and years. The summer of 2025 losses were lower than Russia experienced during any other summer of the Ukraine war so far, Important Stories said. Russia lost 83 tanks and 189 armored vehicles between June and August 2025. In the same period in 2024, Russia lost 268 tanks and 619 armored vehicles. 2023 saw a loss of 274 tanks and 468 vehicles, with 2022 seeing 252 lost tanks and 411 armored vehicles. It seemed that there was a consistent upward trend in Russia's losses over the previous 3 years, only for the summer of 2025 to reverse the trend. This is notable because Russia launched a massive summer offensive in 2025 that you may naturally assume would lead to higher losses, so the question has to be asked, what happened? It's not that Russia achieved any great success during the summer, meaning Ukraine didn't destroy as much of its armor. What happened was that Russia's troops were simply fighting with less armor because of the severe equipment shortages that nearly 4 years of Ukraine destroying what Russia sends has caused. Russia switched to infantry assault tactics following its previous heavy losses in a desperate attempt to retain the ever-diminishing stockpiles of armor it has left. The strategy worked, but it also revealed just how terrible a state Russia's military is in right now. Putin never intended to use anything other than massive mechanized assaults to break Ukraine down. When that didn't work, thanks in large part to Ukraine's brilliant work with drones, Putin had no plan B. So Russia kept using these mechanized assaults until it got itself into the position in which it finds itself now. There is no more armor. Russian soldiers are having to fight without it. As Novaya Gazeta reported in July, Russia is basically running on empty at this point. It highlights that a Ukrainian outlet named Dialogue.ua has reported that Russian tanks, in particular, have ceased to exist as a factor on the battlefield. The outlet adds that the Institute for the Study of War believes that Russia is on track to deplete its armor stockpiles by the end of 2025. That's even though the same think tank says that Russia still has 46% of its pre-war reserves of tanks, along with 42% of its IFVs and 48% of its armored personnel carriers. With those numbers, you would think that Russia would be able to continue its large mechanized assaults for a few more years, but it can't. And the satellite images from the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base reveal why. Having almost half of your pre-war reserves doesn't mean much when most of those reserves are the rotted carcasses of vehicles that haven't been used for decades. The numbers don't lie, but they also don't tell the full story. Russia has a whole lot of nothing left in its storage facilities, and it's all thanks to Ukraine systematically destroying the armor that Russia has sent into Ukraine so far. So what is Russia trying to do to get around all of these armor problems? Its solutions range from the logical to the ridiculous. On the logical side of things, Russia is trying to ramp up the production of new weapons and armor to try to fill the massive gaps created by years of failure in Ukraine. On September 8th, Defense Blog reported that Russia has plans to manufacture hundreds of new tanks, missile systems, and aircraft by the end of 2025. However, the numbers shared match those we already know about. Russia wants to build 250 new T-90s, for instance, which we've already established isn't enough to make up for its losses. Instead, Russia may be filling the gaps by following Ukraine's lead and producing more drones to fight in Ukraine. That's according to the Deputy Chief of Ukraine's Defense Intelligence, Vadim Skibitsky, who tells Defense Blog, "There has been a noticeable increase in the production of unmanned aerial vehicles, especially types like Geran, Harpy, and FPV drones. That's all logical. Less logical is the Russian brainwave of selling its ruined tanks for scrap." On October 6th, United 24 reported that Russia has accepted the fact that it has far too many losses to hide anymore. So it started to sell its destroyed tanks and armored vehicles at auction so they can be scrapped and Russia can earn a few rubles from them. The practice actually started in May, per the Moscow Times report, United 24 says. So far, Russia has sold the ruined shells of T-80, T-72B3 and T-62 tanks, along with a host of IFVs. Prices per unit range from $38,800 to $53,300, United 24 adds. If the state of the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base is anything to go by, Russia could probably earn a few tens of millions of dollars from selling off its useless armor. Of course, that won't solve the whole "no more armor to send to Ukraine" problem. But that's okay because Russia has another solution to that issue. Horses. Yep, you heard that right. Horses. In an October 7th report, United 24 reveals that Russia has revived the ancient art of mounted cavalry, which is something the outlet says hasn't been used since the 1950s. It didn't work, of course. The Russians riding on horseback were promptly picked off by Ukraine's drones because they obviously had no armor. Still, at least they could move a little faster than they could on foot. Not fast enough to outrun a drone, of course, but still faster. Desperation informs every decision Putin and, by extension, the entire Russian military is making right now. Trying to revive ancient tanks and IFVs that haven't been used since the Soviet era is just the start. The reality that Russia's leader now faces is that he can't fight the war he started in the way he wants to fight it. And the way that he fought it would have offered Russia its only pathway to victory as long as the stockpiles held firm. Those stockpiles are depleted, and Russia is now on a slow crawl down the path to defeat. Refined oil fuels the Russian war machine in more ways than one. Directly, Russia's troops need gasoline and diesel to sustain their increasingly limited mechanized assaults against Ukraine's defenses. Indirectly, Russia uses refined oil to bolster its war chest via exports and to pacify its people by ensuring they have gasoline they need to go about their daily lives. But all of this is crumbling down for Russia. The refined oil lifeline is collapsing, and Russia can't do anything about it. September was Vladimir Putin's month from hell as Ukraine and Europe combined to rip the beating oily heart out of Russia and leave the country in a state of panic in the process. There is one number that will sting Putin more than any other: 1 million. That's how many tons of gasoline that a combination of Ukraine's drone strikes and Europe's increasingly stringent measures have cost Russia in September alone. Strikes and sanctions converge, Euromaidan Press said on October 7th, as a combination of clever European Union or EU policy moves and Ukraine's non-stop drone strikes have forced Russia into a catch-22 situation. Does Russia accept domestic shortages? If it does, it means the impact of the Ukraine war will be felt as far as Moscow, meaning Putin will start facing pressure from his people. Maybe Russia can attempt even riskier sanction evasion methods. If it does, it's going to have a problem as the EU is honing in on the shadow fleet. Putin now finds himself careening into a no-win situation, and the ball is already rolling. Take fuel shortages, for instance. Losing 1 million tons of fuel in a single month has to sting somewhere, and massive fuel shortages in many of Russia's most important regions seem to be the outcome. Crimea, which Russia occupied in 2014 and is symbolic of everything that Putin wants to achieve with his Ukraine invasion, is among the hardest hit. Initial signs of an emerging Crimean fuel crisis came on September 25th when the Kyiv Independent reported that up to half of Crimea's gas stations had already halted fuel sales amid shortages. This isn't propaganda coming from a pro-Ukrainian news outlet. The Kyiv Independent says that news of the shutdowns comes from Kommersant, which is a media outlet that is about as pro-Russian as it gets. The outlet monitored 17,000 gas stations around Russia, concluding that shortages were occurring all over the country. Crimea, and the southern federal district in which Russia claims occupied Crimea fits, is suffering the most. More than 220 of that district's gasoline stations, which amounts to 14.2% of the district's total, have been forced to suspend their fuel sales until Russia's gasoline crisis eases. Crimea, which is separated from the Russian mainland and only accessible via water or over the Crimean Bridge, is feeling the brunt of the problem. And it makes sense. Fuel has a long way to go before it reaches Crimea, along with plenty of destinations along the way that will siphon off incoming gasoline supplies. By the time Russia's trains or boats reach the occupied peninsula, there isn't anything left for Crimea's gas stations to sell. Reuters followed up on these reports on September 29th with its own article. By the end of September, Reuters says Crimean authorities had frozen fuel prices to prevent opportunistic gas station owners from using the supply and demand economics that are hurting the peninsula to line their own pockets. Gasoline rationing has also been implemented, with customers limited to buying no more than 30 liters of fuel at a time. That translates to roughly 6.5 gallons. For context, that amounts to about a fifth or a sixth of the amount a Ford F-150's gas tank holds, depending on the model. One of America's most popular vehicles would be severely hamstrung if it were being driven in Crimea. Pravda confirmed the Crimean fuel restrictions a few days after Reuters, adding that some regions of the peninsula are even stricter. They've gone down to 20 liters per customer, with the restrictions affecting 4 types of gasoline: AI-92, AI-95, AI-95NP, and AI-100. Crimea may be the worst affected when it comes to shortages and rationing. However, Putin is being forced to wake up to the fact that Crimea is likely just the beginning. Fuel shortages are happening in other Russian regions, and they're only going to get worse as Ukraine and the EU continue their joint campaign to destroy Russia's refining capacity. We'll get to what they're doing later in the video. First, there's the wider outcome. The 1 million tons lost in September may be the deadline, but it's not the only statistic that matters when it comes to Russia's growing oil refining crisis. Euromaidan Press adds that Ukraine's series of refinery strikes since August have been so effective that they've managed to take around 40% of Russia's refining capacity offline. Major refineries, such as those in Ryazan and Kyiv, have been hit by repeated strikes that show no sign of stopping. Any repairs that Russia attempts to make end up being undone days later when yet another drone takes out a key component of a targeted oil refinery. These amazing results have to be tempered somewhat by a reality check, and the Carnegie Endowment provided that check in an October 3rd examination of Russia's refining situation. On paper, Russia can refine 327 million tons of oil every year, or 6.5 million barrels per day, the endowment points out. And the capacity of the 16 refineries that have been attacked by Ukrainian drones in August and September is 123 million tons a year, or 38% of the total. In other words, 38% is the upper limit of potential damage. The words upper limit are important here because striking a refinery and taking it out entirely are two very different things. Having said that, the Carnegie Endowment makes some interesting points. Russia's on-paper refining capacity isn't its actual capacity in practice. Around 22% of Russia's refineries are idle anyway, which is why the country produces 270 million tons of refined products annually, rather than its maximum of 327 million tons. Ukraine has been hitting the active refineries, meaning it's taking bites out of the other 78% of Russia's refining capacity. Russia also has surpluses of gas and diesel, the endowment notes. The country produces 16% more gasoline than it needs for domestic consumption each year, along with almost 32% more diesel. Russia also has a large supply of naphtha, which can be converted to Euro 3 gasoline with the use of additives. Keep that in mind because we'll be coming back to the use of additives in a moment. Ultimately, the Carnegie Endowment says the 38 to 40% figure may be a little optimistic. Russia is refining around 5 million barrels per day right now. The number would be closer to 4 million if 38% of Russia's refining was offline. This tempers the numbers we've seen up to this point. However, the endowment also closes by noting that this still isn't good news for Russia. Russia's oil refineries are a bit like a man who's being repeatedly punched. He will not die from one punch, or even half a dozen punches, but it becomes harder and harder for him to recover after each subsequent blow. Although no single punch is fatal, he could end up being beaten to death. Ukraine knows this. That's why it's repeating its refinery strikes rather than trying to pull off the one-punch knockout. Each drone that lands chips away at the refining industry that is teetering on the edge of a crisis. Nevertheless, the shortages are very real, and they're happening because Russian stockpiles aren't traditionally used to support the domestic market. The 16% of excess gasoline and 32% of excess diesel Russia produces don't stay in Russia. It gets sold. or it gets sent to the front lines in Ukraine to keep Russia's war machine rolling. To solve the domestic problem, Putin has had to sacrifice one or even both of these two other users of Russia's refined oil products. That just puts Russia's leader right back in the catch-22 situation we described earlier in the video. Looking in from the outside, it certainly doesn't look like Russia has the gasoline and diesel stockpiles to overcome the situation Ukraine and the EU have placed it in. On October 1st, Euromaidan Press noted that Russia is going to need 9 months to deal with its fuel crisis, which is not the sort of timescale you'd expect from a supposed energy superpower. That would put Russia in mid-2026 before it has its fuel situation under control. That likely also assumes that Ukraine stops its refinery strikes and the EU implements no more sanctions. Hint: that isn't going to happen. Still, as Russia attempts to wait out the 9 months, it's taking several increasingly desperate measures to both solve and hide its fuel crisis from its domestic consumers. Leaning on Belarus is one of Russia's tricks. On October 7th, Reuters reported that Belarus rail-transported gasoline exports to Russia quadrupled in September, hitting 49,000 tons in the process. Diesel saw a similar uptick in exports, hitting 33,000 tons. That could only be happening because Russia is trying to tackle the fuel shortage that we've already discussed. However, leaning on Belarus, even if Putin believes that nation is a puppet state, isn't going to work for very long. The country doesn't produce enough gasoline to supply Russia and its own people. As you'll learn if you check out our video on why Russia's relying on Belarus for refined oil is a sign of Putin's growing desperation. With Belarus only able to offer a temporary salve, Russia has turned to other measures to deal with its gasoline crisis, the Moscow Times reports. On October 1st, it announced that Russia is planning to scrap its gasoline import tariffs. It'll also get rid of an additive ban, which links back to the potential use of naphtha we mentioned earlier. Combined, these two measures could redirect around 350,000 tons of gasoline back into Russia's domestic market per month. That's not quite enough to cover the 1 million tons Russia lost in September, but it might at least make the queues at the gasoline stations a little shorter. Russia will also pump around 100,000 tons of diesel per month into the domestic market, assuming these measures are passed. The approach might not work as well as Russia hopes, the Moscow Times adds. The high cost of transport could eliminate any benefit Russian citizens might enjoy from having access to duty-free fuel, the outlet says. Plus, the proposal to allow the limited use of ethanol in gasoline production, along with making standards lax enough to enable higher shares of aromatic hydrocarbons, is another sign of Russia's desperation. Bans on additives and strict technical standards are in place for a reason. The Kremlin being willing to throw them out of the window means it's more concerned with making it look like there's no gasoline crisis in Russia than it is with Russia's people. And if all else fails, the Kremlin can just do what it always does: lie to its people. A September 30th Moscow Times report suggests those lies have already started. Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, is already doing the rounds to claim the Russian people are completely united around President Putin, to the point where they're willing to shoulder any burdens caused by Putin's decisions. But what burdens? In almost the same breath, Peskov also claims that Russia is balanced, predictable, and stable. So why is he saying that Russians are willing to sacrifice when they apparently don't have to worry about sacrificing anything? As for the gasoline shortages, nobody needs to worry about those either. The Moscow Times says that the Kremlin's propagandists are on the case. Shortages are being caused by scheduled oil refinery maintenance, which makes no sense. The Kremlin seems to want to know that its own incompetence is to blame, rather than Ukraine's strikes or Europe's sanctions. Russian state media will only admit that there are several objective factors in play without telling Russia's people that refineries are burning. Putin's month from hell isn't going to be solved by these types of tactics. Belarus can't help for long. Lies may work for a while, but they'll eventually come crashing down as the gasoline shortages worsen and spread further throughout Russia. Even lifting restrictions on how gasoline is made isn't going to be enough. How did Russia even get here? There are two factors in play, both of which we've touched on several times already: Ukraine's long-range drone strikes and European sanctions. They make a potent combination that has the Kremlin on the verge of crumbling. We've talked about the impact of Ukraine's drones already, but we haven't covered what's made these strikes so effective in August and now September. It all comes down to a change in Ukraine's approach. As the BBC points out, Ukraine has been hitting Russian oil refineries since January 2024. That month saw 3 strikes, as did February. The 2024 strikes peaked in May, with 7 refineries being hit before they tapered off for the rest of 2024. Though somewhat effective, these 2024 strikes, along with the ones Ukraine conducted during the early part of 2025, had the same issue. Ukraine would hit a refinery and then move on. That gave Russia a chance to conduct repairs, meaning the struck refinery was never offline for too long. By August 2025, Ukraine had adapted its strategy. Now the first strike on a refinery isn't the only one that Ukraine carries out. Ukraine strikes, waits a few days, and then strikes again and again. The goal is to keep the refinery offline, no matter what Russia tries to do to repair it. In August, Ukraine used this tweaked strategy to target 14 of Russia's refineries. September saw it hit 8 refineries repeatedly. Between January 2024 and September 2025, Ukraine has hit 21 of Russia's 38 large oil refineries. Ukraine's attacks are constant. They're also successful. Ukraine also isn't limiting itself to refinery strikes. As The Economist pointed out in an October 5th article where it dramatically claimed that Ukraine's hellfire is intensifying, other Russian energy infrastructure is also in the Ukrainian crosshairs. Oil pumping stations and oil storage units are also getting hit, with one mid-September attack on the massive oil-loading port of Primorsk standing out. So Ukraine isn't just striking Russia's refineries, it's trying to take out Russia's means of transporting its oil, both within the country and to its external customers. Ukraine is onto a winning strategy here, and the country knows it. October has already seen several more strikes. On October 6th, Ukrainian drones attacked the largest oil terminal in Crimea, which will only add to the woes that the occupied peninsula's citizens are already suffering. And mere hours before we created the script for this video, Ukraine's drones also attacked a Russian refinery in the Siberian region of Tyumen. The Moscow Times says this might represent Ukraine's farthest strike yet, as its drones had to travel over 1,200 miles. Russia says it shot all 3 drones down, but the real outcome hasn't been confirmed by either side yet. As Ukraine pounds away on Russia's refineries, the EU has been getting more active at implementing specific measures that also hurt Russia's refining capacity. Sanctions have played a major role in keeping the refineries that Ukraine strikes offline because they limit Russia's access to the parts it needs to carry out repairs. The New Voice of Ukraine was making this point back in July, as it quoted the Russian energy minister Sergei Savilyov. Why are there sometimes disruptions? Because now, under the sanctions regime we're in, let's say 4 months are planned for repairs, but something was delayed, something was not delivered, Savilyov said. Reuters adds to this, noting that each Ukrainian attack takes weeks or sometimes longer to repair, because Russian engineers simply don't have the access to parts they need to do the work. All the EU has to do now is build on the good work it's already doing. A 19th round of sanctions is coming, which will sting Putin even more. Euromaidan Press says that this package is designed specifically to curb Russia's oil revenues, likely via sanctions being placed on yet more of Putin's shadow fleet. The EU is also likely to accelerate its own ban on liquefied natural gas purchases from Russia, with the ban to be implemented by 2027. Plus, the EU has lowered the price cap on Russian oil to about $48 per barrel. Add all of this to more sanctions placed on the technological supply chains that Russia needs to keep open to support its refineries, and you get a powerful 1-2 punch from Ukraine and the EU. Ukraine shuts them down, the EU's sanctions keep them shut down. The only barrier to the EU's sanctions may be those few members within the bloc that are a little too pro-Russian for the rest of Europe's comfort. Some of the EU's members slow the implementation of sanctions packages, often forcing rewrites and the softening of measures before allowing the packages to pass. Hungary, in particular, has a track record of using its veto power to stop EU sanctions in their tracks. That may stop soon. As Politico reported in August, several European leaders have come up with the idea of making sanctions decisions at the national level, rather than requiring them to have full EU consensus. That would stop the vetoes, though it also opens up opportunities for nations within the EU to not follow through on proposed sanctions. Still, sanctions from most, though not all, EU members are still better than no sanctions. And there's more. Adding to the already powerful combination of Ukrainian drone strikes and EU sanctions, several European nations are now taking a much more active approach to dealing with Russia's shadow fleet vessels. The knock-on effects when it comes to Russia's domestic fuel crisis aren't immediately apparent, however, they are if you look hard enough. More shadow fleet vessels being stopped means less oil being sold by Russia. When Russia sells less oil, it makes less money, which also means it can't pay for as many of the components and parts it can still access to conduct refinery repairs. Russia may also be using its shadow fleet to buy these parts from third-party nations that first buy from the countries that have sanctioned Russia. So cutting the flow in that respect also helps to limit Russian refining, which only builds on Putin's month from hell. France has made a lot of headlines in this respect. In early October, French officials boarded a suspected shadow fleet vessel, taking the ship's captain into custody. Putin denounced the affair as an act of piracy. But for France, it sent a message that the nation would no longer tolerate Russia's shady sanctions-dodging ships in its waters. That ship captain will go on trial in February, The Guardian reports, and it will be interesting to see if other EU nations follow France's lead.
The Ukrainian armed forces may not have been able to match their Russian opponents when it comes to the numbers of troops they can recruit or the tanks they can roll into battle, but they do have one advantage that matters more than almost anything else: home field advantage. They're fighting on their own turf. They know the lay of the land better than anyone else, and they know exactly how to use it to gain an edge on their enemies. It happens time and time again in key frontline territories, and it just happened once more at the boundary between the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. There, Russian units thought they'd forced the Ukrainians into full retreat, but what happened next caught them completely off guard. The incident occurred in the Serebryansky forest in Luhansk Oblast near Crimea, close to the boundary with Donetsk. This dense forest extends across 265 acres of land beside the Seversky Donets River. It was once a peaceful natural reserve and wildlife haven. Now, since it's located right on the front lines of the conflict, it's a massive battlefield, and its tricky terrain, which is largely covered in trees but also includes some areas of swampland, makes it a difficult location for any armed force, be it Ukrainian or Russian, to occupy and travel through safely. Despite the challenges the forest poses, Ukrainian troops managed to maintain control of large parts of the area for several months. During that time, they gained a better understanding of the forest's layout and formed an intricate network of supply routes among the trees so that they could move people and supplies in and out relatively quickly. Unfortunately, Russians repeatedly bombarded the area and eventually pushed the Ukrainian forces back, using drones to gain control of the few viable logistic routes that Ukraine had managed to establish. However, while this may seem like a big win for the Russians at the time, Ukraine's forces soon found a way to turn the tables on their enemy, cleverly transforming their retreat into another tactical advantage. Because the Russians didn't do what the Ukrainians did. They didn't move into the forest and take time to learn the lay of the land and build their own unique web of supply lines. Instead, they just started using those same routes that the Ukrainians had set up in order to quickly funnel more troops and equipment through the area, preparing for the next offensive deeper into the Donetsk region. Since Ukraine's troops had spent so long in that area, they knew exactly which routes the Russians were going to use. So they started sending drones into the forest for perfectly precise strikes on Russian vehicles, personnel, and other assets. Military videos soon emerged from the area, showing the impact of these attacks. One of the clips shows a Ukrainian FPV fiber optic drone traversing almost the entire forest to track down and destroy a Russian UAZ Patriot vehicle, not far from the city of Crimea in the Luhansk region. The drone struck its target with peerless precision, wiping the vehicle off the map and eliminating the Russian officer on board at the time. A second drone went in to scan the scene of the attack and confirmed the kill, demonstrating just how effective Ukraine's drone operations have become. Another incident involved soldiers from Ukraine's 63rd Brigade, who cleverly kept their drones out of sight as they tracked Russian supply trucks moving through the forest. They tailed the trucks all the way to a camouflaged Russian drone control point. The Russian forces likely thought they were perfectly hidden and had no chance of coming under any sort of enemy fire. But they were dead wrong. Once Ukrainian forces had identified the secret control post, they quickly conducted another precise strike, destroying both the position and the Russian drone operators who were using it at the time. On top of all of that, they also wiped out a nearby ammunition depot, dealing a massive blow to Russia's offensive capabilities in the Serebryansky forest, all in the blink of an eye. Now, these incidents were only made possible due to the fact that Ukraine soldiers knew the forest so well and had spent time there, learning the land and figuring out the best ways to traverse the trees and foliage. They used that knowledge to their advantage to flip the script on the Russians, who, despite seeming to have so much cover all around them, suddenly found themselves utterly exposed, vulnerable, and under fire. The Russian forces also weren't helped by the fact that there is little defensive infrastructure in the forest. Again, this is all down to Ukraine. Even though Ukrainian troops controlled the area for an extended spell of time, they didn't take the time to dig out lots of fresh trenches, tunnels, or set up many fortifications there. They had to leave quickly when the Russian attacks began, so left almost nothing behind for the enemy to use. Thanks to that, the Russian soldiers could only rely on the trees themselves for cover, and if they wanted to get a better defensive position, they'd have to dig trenches and construct fortifications of their own, which would take time, manpower, and resources. And given the fact that Russia's frontline troops are notoriously ill-supplied, with many also tired and weak due to a lack of food, water, and rest, they wouldn't have had much energy to construct anything of note. Indeed, reports state that troops in the area have simply been making the most of basic foxholes and improvised shelters here and there, which offer very little protection against artillery strikes and zero protection when it comes to drones, which can easily spot soldiers on the ground and wipe them out before they even have a chance to react. In effect, these Russian troops have a very small chance of survival, and unfortunately for them, their commanders have consistently shown a blatant disregard for the value of life. Time and time again, Russia has thrown scores of soldiers into the meat grinder, thrusting them forward along the front lines towards certain death, without any hope of reinforcement or even the option to retreat and live to fight another day. Instead, they must simply sit in the forest and await their fate. And it's not a pleasant fate. Another video captured in the area showed how Russian soldiers had attempted to conceal themselves in a tight dugout. There were so many of them inside, they had to leave their weapons and ammo outside, on the ground, just so that there would be enough space for all to fit. Tragically for them, that proved to be a disastrous move. Ukraine's drones were scanning the area when one operator spotted the stash of weapons and ammo and instantly understood what had happened. An attack began, and with just 4 munitions dropped on the zone, the dugout was destroyed. The armaments were wiped out, and the soldiers too met their untimely end. This story isn't a one-off occurrence. It's happening throughout the area, as the forest terrain makes it incredibly difficult for Russians to dig in and defend themselves. There's very little space to maneuver, and with trees all around, it's not like the troops can simply make trenches or set up strong shelters or bunkers to defend themselves or stash their supplies. They're basically exposed for every second they spend in Serebryansky, and that makes it almost impossible for them to maintain any kind of true control in the forest. The whole place is like one big death maze, with Ukrainian drones weaving their way through the trees, just waiting and watching for any sign of their enemy, ready to rain down hell in an instant. And the situation shows no signs of improving for the Russian forces. In fact, it's only likely to get worse in the days to come, and here's why. Just beyond the edge of the forest sits the rural settlement of Yampil in the Donetsk region. For now, Yampil is under Ukraine's control, but it's the next obvious target for the Russian forces. They clearly went to break through the forest, force Ukrainian troops out of Yampil, and establish a foothold there that they can use to push on for further attacks and land grabs deeper into Donetsk. But there are 2 problems with that strategy. First, the Russians are suffering so much within the forest itself, thanks to Ukraine's clever tactics, that they can't even get enough troops and supplies all the way through to mount any sort of serious offensive in the Yampil direction. It will likely take much more time for Russia to actually find a way to build up a sufficient force at the far end of the forest, and in that time, they'll continue to suffer greatly, with many troops either killed or injured, vehicles destroyed, and other assets and supplies taken out by Ukraine's drones. Secondly, because they're so focused on Yampil, the Russians' movements have become even more predictable. They were able to take control of one large trench fortification at the forest's edge, just across from the village, and Russian commanders clearly intend to use that location as a springboard for their next attack towards the settlement. But that also means that all Russia's troops and supplies are heading in that specific direction, towards that specific fortification, and then onward towards Yampil. Ukraine already had a full map of all the possible routes the Russians might take through the forest, and now it knows exactly where they're headed at all times. That makes it even easier for drone operators to pick off targets one by one, and it makes life dramatically harder for Russians as they desperately attempt to scramble their way through the zone. This was proven in a recent video shared by Ukraine's 81st Air Mobile Brigade. The clip shows a pair of surviving Russians, the last 2 members of an assault group, that managed to make it through the forest and into Yampil via the same route mentioned previously. With their comrades taken out, the pair decided to take shelter in a basement, but it wasn't sufficient to save their lives. Ukraine's drone operators honed in on their hideout, forcing the troops out into the open, where they were quickly taken out by infantry fire. This sort of thing is happening on a regular basis. Ukraine soldiers report regular sightings of small Russian groups breaking through the forest lines and proceeding onward into Yampil, but almost none of them survive, because drone operators are constantly monitoring that exact area, picking off the infiltrators like shooting fish in a barrel. Thanks to this, Russia's forces are never able to build up or gain any sort of momentum in the Yampil direction, and for the time being at least, Russian commanders are once again refusing to adjust their strategy. They continue to order small groups of troops along those same routes, right under the noses of Ukraine's drones, blindly and foolishly hoping that eventually somehow it will work out in their favor. If the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, then Russian commanders quite clearly fit the bill. and in many ways the situation in the Serebryansky is almost a microcosm of the entire war. Up and down the front lines and elsewhere in Ukraine, Russia's military leaders have consistently persisted with their tactics. They've demonstrated an astonishingly stubborn inability to adjust their strategy, constantly following a brute force approach to the conflict, relying on numerical superiority to see them through to victory. It hasn't worked, but they still continue to rely on this tactic despite suffering extraordinary losses. A recently leaked internal document revealed the full extent of those losses, with official Russian sources admitting that over 281,000 of their troops had either been killed, wounded, gone missing, or been captured by Ukraine. The same leak also noted that Russia had permanently lost more than 13,000 pieces of military equipment, with close to 50,000 others damaged but still repairable. This demonstrates just how wasteful the Kremlin has been with its resources. Yes, it has the larger army and bigger supplies of tanks, armor, and other equipment, but it hasn't constructed a suitable strategy to make smart use of those advantages. It has instead simply thrown everything it can at Ukraine, hoped that it will be enough to strong-arm the opposition into submission, and simply counteracted losses by recruiting more men and manufacturing more equipment. It's not a sustainable strategy, and it has no chance of working out in Russia's favor in the long term, because the losses are mounting up by the day and will eventually be too costly for even the Kremlin to bear. And the same story is playing out in and around the Serebryansky forest, albeit on a smaller scale. There too, Russia is treating troops like cannon fodder, funneling more and more units into the area, and watching as its personnel and its equipment, including vehicles and ammo, are blown to bits by Ukrainian drone strikes. But instead of thinking of an alternative strategy, taking a different route through the forest, or even finding a way to circumvent Serebryansky entirely and catch Ukraine out with some sort of tactical flanking maneuver, the Kremlin's commanders persist with tired, wasteful, and downright incompetent decisions. As long as the Russians continue down this same path, Ukraine's forces will have little to no trouble continuing to wipe them out, and this is almost entirely thanks to Ukrainian drone operators. Kyiv's fighters on the ground have even admitted that without the drones, their defenses probably wouldn't be strong enough to hold out in the area for too long. They would crumble under the sheer weight of enemy troops and equipment. But with drone operators working around the clock, using their eyes in the skies to scan the ground, spot Russian troops and take them out, the Ukrainian defenses are standing strong, and each successful strike buys Ukraine more time to solidify its position, resupply its units, and prepare for the next assault. And because of this, Yampil remains in Ukraine's hands, and is likely to stay that way for the foreseeable future, as the Russians repeatedly struggle to establish any sort of meaningful foothold in the area. It's exactly the same sort of situation that's being played out up and down the front lines. In the Pokrovsk area, for example, situated southwest of Yampil, Russian forces have been trying for months now to establish a foothold and force Ukraine's defenders out of the city, so they can then use it as a base for launching successive attacks deeper into Donetsk. But they've been utterly unable to do so, even after amassing a massive force in the area, with some estimates putting the numbers at more than 110,000 troops. Russia hasn't yet taken Pokrovsk. It's tried repeatedly, and it's even shown some willingness to test out different strategies, using everything from drones to artillery, and even tanks or small units of disguised soldiers tasked with sneaking into the city to sabotage it from within. Nothing has worked, and Ukraine's defenders have used their knowledge of the area, their all-important home field advantage, to enjoy tactical superiority over their opponents. So, even though Russia has the numbers, the resources, the manpower, none of that is enough to achieve any sort of notable victory. Instead, the numbers of Russian losses, both in terms of personnel and equipment, just keep on rising. Ukraine's drones keep on raining down fire from above. And these sorts of stalemate situations play out day after day and night after night. Russia is getting nowhere fast, and it's paying a gigantic price despite making very little or no progress in the areas that matter most. This truly is one of the most wasteful war efforts ever seen involving a major military nation, and it shows no signs of improving. Ukraine, meanwhile, continues to demonstrate the kind of tactical intelligence and ingenuity that the country has become synonymous with. Even when it seems to be on the verge of a defeat, it finds ways to turn harsh situations and adversity in its favor. In Serebryansky, for example, any observer would have thought that Russia was in the ascendancy when it forced Ukraine soldiers out of the area. They were seemingly chased out by a stronger opponent, forced to give up valuable ground, or at least that's how it first appeared. In reality, Ukraine simply made the smart move. Its forces could have remained in the forest and conducted long drawn-out battles with the enemy, likely losing a lot of lives and supplies in the process. That's exactly what Russia would have done. But Ukraine doesn't operate like Russia. Its commanders prefer to think 2, 3, 4 steps ahead, rather than focusing purely and simply on the present moment. For them, it's not simply about holding the most territory, it's about making the most of the territory they have. That's why they made the tactical decision to call the troops out of the forest, and then found ways to make that forest a genuine death trap for the enemy. They lured Russians into using the exact same routes and pathways that they had used before, turning what seemed like a weakness into an invaluable advantage. Now, yet again, it's Ukraine in the power position, and Russia struggling to survive, as its squads are torn apart by Ukraine's drones before they can build up any sort of momentum. The Serebryansky forest was supposed to be Russia's springboard for attacks on Yampil and beyond. Instead, it's turning into a slaughterhouse. The battle cries ring out. Russia's invading hordes go charging towards a Ukrainian defensive position. Following orders from a commander who knows exactly how this battle is going to turn out, Russia is going to lose. Why? Because its soldiers aren't equipped with armor, like tanks or infantry fighting vehicles. They're not even riding motorbikes, which could get them enough speed and agility to avoid Ukraine's drones. No, they're riding in the fight on something more equine. Four-legged beasts of burden are now carrying Russia's forces into battle. Just look how desperate Vladimir Putin has become. Russian troops are now riding horses into the Ukraine war's drone hell. Worse yet, as United 24 media reported on October 7, the Russian soldier who was on horseback has already been killed. The outlet states that 2025 marks the first time since the 1950s that Russia has deployed cavalry against an enemy. And this doesn't mean merely using horses or donkeys to carry equipment here. Russia has sent a kitted out soldier into an assault on horseback, and for some reason seems to have expected that soldier to make it through Ukraine's waves of drones to reach some sort of position. It makes no sense. Even without the drones, a horseback rider doesn't stand much of a chance in modern warfare. It only takes one shot from a rifle to take out a cavalry unit in the modern age. This isn't medieval warfare. It's not an age when soldiers took minutes to reload a musket before they could take a pot shot at a horseback rider. It's 2025. There are drones, rifles, mines. Practically any weapon that Ukraine might decide to bring to bear is enough to take out a Russian horseback rider. Of course, it ended up being a drone that finished off the unfortunate Russian cavalryman. And footage confirms the entire fiasco. The video was shared by the Yigal Levin X account, which noted that it was shot by a drone being operated by a member of Ukraine's 132nd Battalion. The footage seems nondescript enough at first. It shows what in other circumstances could be a beautiful countryside setting, shot from the perspective of a first-person view or FPV drone as it flies along a natural trail. As the drone idles forward, what first appeared like a blob in the near distance starts to come into focus. It's not a blob, it's a horse. Perhaps somehow, amidst all of the warfare in Ukraine's countryside, a single wild horse had managed to survive and was wandering through the fields. But no, that's not what's happening. As the drone draws closer, it soon becomes clear that a man is tending to the horse. He's dressed in military fatigues and he has no idea that the drone is appearing. That man is a Russian soldier, and he's about to become a casualty. As soon as the operator realizes what they're seeing through the eyes of their FPV drone, the drone speeds up. It zeroes in on the soldier, who realizes how much danger he's in far too late. A last-ditch attempt to jump away from his horse fails, and Ukraine's drone scores a direct hit on the ground between them. Both horse and rider died because Putin has become so desperate that he's sending his soldiers into battle on animals instead of armored vehicles. Defense Blog, which also carried the video, says that the targeted horse rider wasn't some lone maverick who decided that it would be better to attack on horseback. He was part of an entire cavalry detachment that Russia used to storm a Ukrainian defensive position. Obviously, that assault failed, with Defense Blog adding that the Russian soldiers resorted to dismounting from their horses and using them as shields in an attempt to avoid Ukraine's drones. That lends a new perspective to the FPV drone footage. Perhaps the Russian soldier wasn't idly tending to his horse at all. He was more likely hiding behind it, only to be undone by having positioned his horse in the wrong direction. Ukraine soldiers don't feel good about any of this. Creating more Russian casualties is obviously Ukraine's priority. However, the country's soldiers would much rather not be sending drones to explode on horses. Defense Blog reports on the comments of one Ukrainian service member who sums up the shock and sadness of these types of incidents. The horses, of course, are a pity, but no matter how you look at it, it's a combat unit. Sad, yes, but the work is being done to reduce human casualties, the service member said. One could almost argue that this is callous on Putin's part. There's no need for Russia to be using horses to launch assaults in 2025. Even the most basic of civilian vehicles would offer more speed and strength. But Putin doesn't seem to care. Horses are a way to transport his cannon-foddered troops to the places where they're supposed to die to soak up Ukraine's ammunition, so Russia's military is happy to use them. Ukraine soldiers, as the service member says, have to treat those horses as military units, which means they have to be taken out. What's evident here is a very nasty use of horses by Russia. But it's not the first time Russia has used these types of animals in Ukraine. Back in February, Newsweek reported that Russia had started to deploy both donkeys and surprisingly camels into Ukraine. In both cases, the animals weren't being ridden into battle. Rather, Russia was using them to shuttle equipment between units, ensuring that Russia's soldiers had access to necessary goods that could no longer be transported by vehicles because too many of Russia's mechanized units had been destroyed or disabled. The outlet even carried a quote from the Russian State Duma Defense Committee member, Lieutenant General Viktor Sobolev, who implied that Russia was taking inspiration from World War II. Back then, Russia used dogs and donkeys to ferry essentials around. It was now being forced to do the same in Ukraine. There are currently very big difficulties in providing units and subdivisions, including that is, assault squads and groups and so on, with ammunition, military technical equipment and food too, Sobolev claimed. He went on to add that dogs and cats are also being deployed because they help to fight mice in Russia's trenches. Sobolev also made mention of horses, noting that they'd also been put to work in the trenches. As for camels, a photograph started doing the rounds on social media in February, shared by the Meanwhile in Ukraine Facebook account. The photo shows 3 Russian soldiers and a camel. The channel itself says that it hopes that the image was photoshopped. However, camels are raised in the Russian republics of Tuva and Kalmyka, so it's possible that the photo is real. The Moscow Times also confirmed the Russian military's use of donkeys in a March 2025 piece. It also linked that usage to a lack of frontline equipment, while noting that both horses and donkeys were being used by Russia to transport equipment. Apparently, this is a normal practice, the outlet quotes Sobolev as saying. Perhaps it is. One could even argue that using these types of animals is better than having soldiers carrying equipment, at least over short distances. However, what went down in early October is very different from Russia's military using horses and donkeys to hoist equipment around. The soldier that Ukraine's drone took out was a cavalryman. He, along with his unit, has launched an attack on horseback, only to discover very quickly why that was a bad idea. Now that Russia has seen that its cavalry idea is so vulnerable to drones, one might assume it would abandon the concept. But that would overestimate Russia's capacity to learn from its failures. Not only is Russia okay with its soldiers riding into battle on horseback, but it looks like cavalry training is about to be formalized in the Russian military. To repeat that, cavalry training is being formalized, which means that what seems to be an isolated incident of Russian soldiers attacking on horseback may soon become a regular occurrence in Ukraine. That news comes from Medusa, which covered an October report published by the pro-Russian news outlet Kommersant that claimed Russia is looking to conduct a full-blown revival of its cavalry units. The Russian outlet spoke to the unnamed commander of Russia's Storm Special Forces unit, who said on Russian state television that the soldiers under his command are now learning how to ride on horseback. The reasons why are strange to say the least. The commander says that horses have better instincts than humans, meaning they're less likely to step on landmines. Plus, they have better eyesight, allowing them to navigate through the darkness, and they're able to deal with off-road conditions. The commander even explained how his troops would use their horses. The tactic involves two men riding on a single horse. One steers and the other provides fire cover. Upon arrival at the assault site, both fighters dismount and take the next enemy stronghold, the commander said. There are obvious holes to pick in all of these comments. For instance, it's believable that a horse is more able to navigate in the dark than a human who isn't equipped with night vision equipment. But how is that going to help the soldiers riding the horse? They won't be able to see where they're going, and they certainly have no chance of identifying or destroying incoming threats before it's too late. It seems Russia's riders just have to rely on their horses' instincts to get them to where they need to go. As for the two-person approach the Storm Commander discusses, surely providing fire cover is a lot harder on a horse that's jostling its riders around than it is to offer that cover from the ground. Would a Russian soldier, who's already sitting two to a horse in all of their combat gear, really be able to shoot down an incoming Ukrainian drone as their comrade rides? It seems unlikely. To many, it will even seem ludicrous. Plus, as Medusa notes, horses come with certain disadvantages that the Storm Commander doesn't seem to account for. Yes, the animals are quick and agile, but they also need to be trained and fed, which are both actions that cost time and resources that Russia doesn't really have. Plus, horses have a lower load capacity than vehicles. As mentioned earlier, even if Russia is struggling to send soldiers into assaults with armor, even a civilian vehicle seems like it would be a better choice than a horse. As for landmines, a horse may or may not be heavy enough to trigger an anti-tank mine, but an anti-personnel mine, that's a different story. Given that Ukraine acquired this latter type of mine from the US in November 2024, odds are good that they're being used to defend against Russia's attacks too. A horse wouldn't stand a chance against such a mine, neither would the horse's rider. So, the burning question has to be asked: why? Despite the Storm Commander's claims, horses aren't being ridden into battle because they're more effective than tanks, armored vehicles, or practically any other type of vehicle that Russia could use instead. That much is obvious. A horse, as fast as it might be, can't outrun an FPV drone. Pet MD says that a thoroughbred horse can maybe hit speeds of 44 miles per hour at full pace over a short distance. Russia won't be using thoroughbreds. Its horses will be much slower and their riders aren't world-class jockeys. Pet MD adds that the top galloping speed of a horse in the general home environment is between 25 and 35 miles per hour. The average horse also wouldn't be able to maintain this pace over a long distance. By contrast, even the most basic Ukrainian FPV drone can hit and maintain speeds of 37 miles per hour, with many being even faster. Even if a horse could outrun a drone over a short distance, it won't be long before the horse slows down and the drone catches up. Combat effectiveness doesn't enter the equation here. So, again, it has to be asked: why? United 24 has some possible reasons for why Russia is digging back into centuries-old tradition by sending soldiers into battle on horseback, starting with Russia's love affair with horses. It says that horses are woven so deeply into the mythology of past Russian military success that their use in 2025 is almost more symbolic than it is practical. But even that's a distortion. The Cossacks, who were famous for their use of horses, formed major communities in both what is now Ukraine, particularly the Zaporizhian Cossacks, and in Russia's Don region. But while those traditions share deep roots, Ukraine isn't the one riding horses into battle today. Russia is. Still, the Russian love of horses endured even into the 20th century, and to be fair to Russia, the beasts had their uses even as recently as World War II. This is evident in a June 1942 piece from the War Illustrated, which has been shared by Traces of War. Russia has millions of horses in service with the Red Army. Without them, in spite of the railways and the immense number of motor vehicles, it would be impossible to maintain the constant stream of supplies to the millions of men holding the millions of miles long front. The War Illustrated said over 80 years ago. Hundreds of thousands are actually in the firing line, hauling guns and ammunition wagons. Great numbers more are harnessed to ambulances and supply vehicles. That sounds familiar. It's precisely what horses and their like were being used for in Ukraine before they started being deployed as cavalry units. After World War II, United 24 says, the horse became a symbol of political power in the Soviet Union. Propaganda posters often showed Russian soldiers on horseback, and it's in this that one may see a glimpse of the reason why Russians are now riding horses into battle. Footage has shown one of those riders get taken out by a drone. It's possible that very different images are being circulated in Russia. Perhaps images of Russian soldiers bravely riding, harkening back to the Soviet era to which Putin appears intent on returning to the world. This talk of symbolism is all well and good. It might be even something that Russia would encourage, if not for the fact that the only reason horses are being discussed is because a Russian cavalryman was destroyed by a Ukrainian drone. But strip away the symbolism, and there are 3 real reasons why Russia is using horses in Ukraine. Russia is running out of fuel, it's lost too many vehicles, and its soldiers are absolutely exhausted. On the fuel front, Ukraine has spent the last couple of months devastating Russia's oil refining capacity. The BBC reports that Ukraine has conducted strikes against 21 of Russia's 38 large oil refineries since January 2024. In August 2025 alone, Ukraine targeted 14 refineries with drone attacks. September saw it hit 8, and in most cases, these weren't isolated strikes. Ukraine would strike, wait a short while, and then strike again to ensure that the refineries it put offline stayed offline. The impact of these strikes has been monumental on Russia. The country is currently going through a fuel crisis because Ukraine has managed to take out up to 40% of Russia's refining capacity by late September and early October 2025, following months of cumulative strikes throughout the year. While this is hurting everyday Russians due to domestic gasoline shortages, it's also having an impact on the front lines. The Ukrainian army's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrsky, made that much clear toward the end of September. The capabilities of the enemy's military-industrial complex have been significantly reduced. We can see this on the battlefield, Syrsky said when speaking to Ukrainian journalists. This is a fuel crisis in Russia which directly affects logistics and the supply of its army. In short, Russia doesn't have enough gasoline to send to the front lines. Horses don't run on gasoline, so using them is a problem solved, at least in Putin's mind. Even if Russia had a steady supply of gasoline and the supply lines to get it to its troops, it wouldn't matter. Gasoline, along with diesel, is useless when lacking the vehicles that they fuel. Therein lies another reason why Russia is using horses to launch assaults. It's running out of tanks and armored vehicles, and it has been for a while. In July, Novaya Gazeta reported that Russia is running on close to empty when it comes to military vehicles. It cited statistics shared by the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, which said that Russia only has 46% of its pre-war reserves of tanks and 42% of its infantry fighting vehicles left. Those numbers may seem fine at first, however, most of the remains of Russia's vehicle stockpiles are old Soviet-era pieces of armor that are in terrible states of disrepair. At this rate, the ISW says, Russia will be out of usable armor reserves entirely by the end of 2025. Russia's outlook may not be quite that bleak, but it does shed some more light on why it's using horses in Ukraine. The vehicles Russia's military needs, whether that be for transporting equipment or launching assaults, are in much shorter supply than they were when Putin launched his invasion. In the use of horses, there's desperation. The Storm Unit commander mentioned earlier may try to dress up the use of horses as a deliberate tactic. However, it's really an admission by Moscow that it doesn't have enough equipment to send to its troops. Some are still able to ride into battle on armor. Those who can't seem to be resorting to horses. And finally, there's the exhaustion factor. Perhaps because of its armor and fuel issues, Russia has increasingly relied on small infantry assaults ahead of the larger mechanized assaults it favored earlier in the Ukraine war. RBC Ukraine reported on this approach back in July, noting that some of Russia's infantry units are as small as 3 or 4 people. Those units are supposed to infiltrate Ukraine's defenses and bed in long enough for reinforcements to arrive. But think about what this approach must mean for Russia's soldiers. They're being forced to march over long distances, carrying whatever equipment they have to conduct their assaults, all while trying to hide away from Ukraine's drones. Exhaustion has to set in to the point where even the units that manage to infiltrate Ukraine's defenses aren't able to put up much of a fight when they're found. At least with horses, these small units can cover more distance quickly while relying on their horses to carry heavy gear. But again, this is what modern military vehicles are supposed to be doing. Not very vulnerable animals that have no resistance to any of the weapons Ukraine uses. The video of a Russian cavalryman being taken out by Ukrainian drone is many things. It's humiliating for Russia because it exposes just how bad the country's military situation has become. The video is almost pitiable, as it shows the last moments of panic for a Russian soldier before he and a horse, who should never have been on the battlefield, are eliminated. But most of all, the video showcases Russia's desperation in Ukraine. Using horses isn't symbolic as much as the Kremlin may want to act like it is. It's foolish, and Russia is already being made to pay the price. Still, it's not like Russia is enjoying much more success with its modern weapons. Several of its supposedly unstoppable weapons have been wiped off the map as Ukraine has destroyed them all. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of Russia's weirdest tactics in the Ukraine war.